It was one of those perfect afternoons in the city, the kind where the golden sunlight streamed through the trees, casting intricate shadows on the cobblestone streets. The air buzzed with life, couples strolling hand in hand, street performers drawing small crowds, and the faint hum of conversations spilling out from nearby cafes. Amidst all this vibrancy stood a restaurant, a beacon of sophistication and exclusivity. Its name alone carried weight, whispered among the elite as the place to dine, where reservations were made months in advance, and every detail, down to the placement of a single flower on a table, was meticulously curated. Inside, the atmosphere was nothing short of opulent. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling, their light reflecting off polished marble floors. The soft clinking of glasses and the murmur of elegant conversations filled the air. Waiters moved with precision, their uniforms spotless, their movements choreographed like a ballet. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a stage, and everyone inside was playing their part in a performance of wealth and status. And then she walked in. She didn't fit the script. Not even close. The woman pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside, her presence immediately drawing curious glances from those seated near the entrance. She wasn't dressed for this kind of place, not by their standards. Her coat was simple, worn at the edges, and her shoes had clearly seen better days. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and there wasn't a trace of makeup on her face. But there was something about her, something unspoken yet undeniable. She carried herself with quiet confidence, as if she belonged anywhere she chose to be, no matter what anyone else thought. She paused for a moment at the entrance, taking in her surroundings. Her eyes swept over the room, not with envy or intimidation, but with calm curiosity. It was as if she were observing an art exhibit rather than stepping into one of the most exclusive dining establishments in the city. The hostess at the front desk noticed her immediately. Dressed in a sleek black dress that screamed designer label, the hostess had perfected the art of polite condescension, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a tone that was just warm enough to mask its underlying frostiness. "Good afternoon," the hostess said, her voice smooth but clipped. "Do you have a reservation?" The woman smiled, a small, genuine smile that seemed almost out of place in this world of pretense. "No," she said simply. "I was hoping to get a table." The hostess's perfectly arched eyebrows lifted ever so slightly, a subtle but unmistakable signal of judgment. She glanced down at her reservation book as if searching for an excuse. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment, her tone now tinged with thinly veiled disdain. "We're fully booked for today." The woman nodded slowly, her expression unchanged. "I see," she said softly. "Well, thank you anyway." She turned to leave, but before she could take more than a step toward the door, another voice cut through the air, a voice dripping with sarcasm. "Fully booked? Or just not for her?" The comment came from a man seated near the entrance, a regular customer by the looks of him, his tailored suit fitting him like a second skin. He leaned back in his chair with an amused smirk, swirling his wine glass lazily as he watched the scene unfold. The hostess shot him a sharp look but didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to her desk and pretended to busy herself with paperwork. The woman hesitated for just a moment before continuing toward the door. But as she reached for it, something unexpected happened. One of the waiters, young and clearly new to this environment, stepped forward hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of conversation. "If you'd like, I think we might be able to find you a seat." The hostess whipped around to face him, her expression icy enough to freeze water on contact. "That won't be necessary," she said sharply before turning back to the woman with that same practiced smile. "Thank you for stopping by." For a brief moment, just a flicker, the woman's calm exterior seemed to waver. It wasn't anger or humiliation that crossed her face, but something deeper, something quieter, yet infinitely more powerful: disappointment. It was as if she had expected this outcome all along but had hoped, just for once, that things might be different. She nodded again, more to herself than anyone else, and stepped outside into the afternoon light. As soon as she was gone, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Conversations resumed, laughter rippled through the air once more, and it was as if nothing had happened at all. But outside was where everything would change. The woman stood on the sidewalk for a moment, pulling out her phone from her pocket. She dialed a number quickly and brought it to her ear. "It's me," she said softly when someone picked up on the other end. There was no anger in her voice, only calm resolve. "I'm at that restaurant we talked about." There was a pause as whoever was on the other line responded. "Yes," she continued after a moment. "That one." Another pause. "No," she said finally, glancing back at the restaurant's ornate facade with an almost imperceptible smile playing at her lips. "They didn't let me in." And then she hung up. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and turned away from the restaurant, but not before catching sight of something out of the corner of her eye. Faces pressed against windows inside, watching her leave with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to outright disdain. They thought they knew who she was, what kind of person she must be, but they didn't have even half of it right. Because what they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly guessed, was that this story wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. It was the kind of evening that made the city feel alive. The streets were bustling, glowing under the soft amber light of street lamps, and the air carried the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. Inside the restaurant, everything was perfectly curated, the lighting dimmed to just the right level, the sound of soft jazz weaving through conversations like a gentle thread. It was a world of elegance, exclusivity, and quiet indulgence. But amidst this polished perfection, there was an undercurrent, a ripple that had started earlier when a woman walked through the door. She wasn't dressed for this kind of place, her worn coat and simple shoes standing out like a misplaced note in a symphony. And yet, there had been something about her, something that lingered even after she left. The hostess returned to her station, her posture stiff as she tried to shake off the interaction. She hadn't thought much of it at first. People like that didn't belong here. This was a restaurant for the elite, for those who could afford to spend hundreds on a single meal without blinking. But as the minutes ticked by, she found herself glancing toward the door more often than usual, as if expecting something or someone. And then it happened. A sleek Porsche pulled up outside, its glossy black surface reflecting the lights of the city like liquid night. The car was an unmistakable symbol of wealth and power, turning heads even in a place where luxury was commonplace. The hostess straightened instinctively, her professional smile returning as she prepared to greet whoever stepped out. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who immediately commanded attention. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed to mold itself to his frame. His presence was magnetic, sharp features, confident stride, and there was an air about him that made people stop and look without even realizing they were doing it. He didn't hesitate as he walked toward the entrance, his movements purposeful and unhurried. When he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, not dramatically but subtly, like the way a room feels different when someone important walks in. The hostess greeted him with her most polished smile. "Good evening," she said smoothly. "Do you have a reservation?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the room briefly before turning his gaze back to her, a gaze so piercing it felt like it could see right through her. "I'm looking for someone," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. The hostess blinked, momentarily thrown off by his directness. "Of course," she replied quickly. "May I ask who you're looking for?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. After typing something quickly, he held it up to his ear and waited. "Where are you?" he said when someone answered on the other end. There was a pause as he listened to the response. "Outside?" he repeated, his tone shifting slightly, still calm, but now tinged with something else, something harder to define. Another pause. "I'll be right there," he said before hanging up abruptly. Without another word to the hostess or anyone else in the room, he turned and walked back toward the door. The hostess watched him go, her curiosity piqued but tempered by professionalism. She didn't know who he was or what had brought him here, but she could tell one thing. This wasn't just another customer looking for a table. Outside, the woman from earlier was still standing near the curb. She hadn't left yet, not because she couldn't, but because she hadn't wanted to. There had been something about this place that had drawn her in, a curiosity she couldn't quite explain, and even after being turned away, she found herself lingering. When she saw him step out of the restaurant and walk toward her, her expression softened, not surprised but relieved. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment before speaking. "Are you okay?" he asked simply. She nodded but didn't say anything right away. Instead, She glanced back at the restaurant briefly before returning her gaze to him. "They wouldn't let me in," she said quietly, not bitterly or angrily, but with a kind of resigned acceptance that carried its own weight. He frowned slightly, not at her, but at what she'd said, and turned to look at the restaurant himself. His jaw tightened just enough to be noticeable before he spoke again. "Come with me," he said firmly but gently. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding again and following him back inside. When they walked through the door together this time, everything changed. The hostess's eyes widened slightly when she saw them enter, her polished demeanor faltering just enough for those paying attention to notice. The man didn't stop at her desk or wait for an explanation. Instead, he walked straight past her into the main dining area with the woman by his side. Heads turned as they moved through the room, not because they were loud or disruptive, but because their presence demanded attention in a way that couldn't be ignored. Conversations paused, glasses hovered midair. Even the waitstaff seemed momentarily frozen as they watched them pass by. The man stopped near one of the tables and gestured for one of the senior staff members, a manager, to come over. When the manager approached hesitantly, clearly unsure of what was happening, the man spoke again, this time louder so everyone nearby could hear. "This is my wife," he said plainly but powerfully enough that it felt like an announcement rather than just a statement. The room went silent, completely silent, as his words sank in. "She came here earlier," he continued after a brief pause, "and you turned her away." His tone wasn't angry or accusatory. It was calm, but carried an undeniable weight that made every word feel significant. "I want you all to remember something," he added after another pause. "You don't judge people by what they wear or how they look, or by any other superficial measure." He glanced around at everyone nearby before finishing, "Because you never know who they really are." The silence lingered long after he stopped speaking, an uncomfortable yet necessary silence filled with reflection rather than fear or embarrassment. And just like that, everything changed again, but this time for good. The door to the restaurant swung open with a quiet grace, but the impact was anything but subtle. Heads turned almost instinctively, conversations faltered mid-sentence, and even the soft strains of jazz seemed to fade into the background. A man stepped inside, tall and commanding, his tailored suit fitting him like it had been crafted by the hands of an artist. His presence was magnetic, pulling the attention of everyone in the room without him uttering a single word. He walked with purpose, each step deliberate, as though he owned not just the space but the very air within it. His sharp features caught the light, high cheekbones, a strong jawline that seemed chiseled from stone. But it wasn't just his appearance that made people look twice. It was something deeper, something intangible. Confidence radiated from him like heat from a flame, and yet there was no arrogance in his stride. He carried himself with a quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. As he moved further into the room, whispers rippled through the crowd like waves on a still pond disturbed by a single drop. "Who is he?" someone murmured under their breath. "He looks familiar," another whispered. But no one dared to approach him. He wasn't just a man entering a restaurant. He was an event. The hostess at the front desk straightened immediately when she saw him approach. Her polished demeanor faltered for just a fraction of a second before she recovered, plastering on her most professional smile. "Good evening," she said brightly, though her voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Do you have a reservation?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his gaze sweep across the room, taking in every detail with sharp precision. His eyes were searching for something or someone, and when they finally landed on the hostess again, they were filled with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. "I'm looking for my wife," he said simply, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. The hostess blinked, momentarily thrown off by his directness. "Your wife?" she repeated, as though trying to buy herself time to process what he'd said. "Yes," he replied, his tone steady but firm. "She came here earlier." Recognition flickered across her face then, a realization that hit her like a slap she hadn't seen coming. The woman from earlier, could it be? I believe she may have been here," the hostess stammered, her polished exterior beginning to crack under his gaze. "But I wasn't aware." She was turned away. He interrupted gently but firmly, cutting through her excuses like a blade through silk. The hostess froze, her face paling slightly as she realized the gravity of what had happened. She opened her mouth to respond, to apologize or explain, but no words came out. The man's expression didn't change much as he watched her struggle for words. There was no anger in his eyes, at least not outwardly. But there was something else, disappointment. It was subtle but unmistakable, and somehow it cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. "I need to speak with your manager," he said finally, his voice as calm as ever but laced with an underlying intensity that left no room for argument. "Of course," the hostess said quickly, nodding as she scrambled to find the manager. As she hurried away, the man turned slightly and glanced around the room again. The whispers had grown louder now. People were leaning toward each other in hushed tones, speculating about who he was and why he was here. But he paid them no mind. A moment later, the manager appeared, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority that seemed to shrink slightly under the billionaire's gaze. He extended his hand nervously as he approached. "Good evening," the manager said cautiously. "How can I assist you?" The man didn't take his hand. Instead, he looked him directly in the eye and said four words that hung in the air like a thunderclap. "You turned my wife away." The manager's face fell instantly, his confident demeanor crumbling like sand underfoot. I wasn't aware," he began weakly before trailing off under the weight of the man's stare. "She came here earlier," the man continued evenly, his voice low but resonant enough to carry across the room. "She asked for a table, something simple, and she was told no." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. "I don't care about excuses," the man went on after a brief pause. "What I care about is how you treat people. All people, not just those who look like they belong here." His words cut through the room like lightning through a stormy sky. The staff nearby froze in place. Even some of the guests stopped eating mid-bite to listen. "This restaurant," he continued after another pause, gesturing subtly around him with one hand, "is supposed to be about more than just food and ambience. It's supposed to be about hospitality, about making people feel welcome." He let those words hang in the air for a moment before adding quietly but powerfully, "And today, you failed." The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy stillness that seemed to press down on everyone in earshot. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was likely only seconds, the manager spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." The man nodded slightly but didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. "Come inside," he said simply when someone answered on the other end of the line. Moments later, all eyes turned toward the entrance once more as she walked in, the woman who had been turned away earlier now re-entering alongside her husband. This time, everything was different. This time, no one dared to look down on her or judge her by what she wore or how she looked, because now they knew who she really was, and more importantly, they knew who he was. But even as they watched her re-enter with newfound respect, or perhaps fear, there was one thing they couldn't have known. This wasn't just about one woman or one moment or even one mistake. This was about something bigger, something deeper, a lesson that would echo far beyond these walls. Never judge someone by appearances alone, because you never know who they might be or what they might teach you about yourself. The room was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. No, this was a silence that carried weight. A silence that held the collective breath of everyone present. The woman stood at the center of it all, her presence calm, yet commanding. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes, she didn't wear sparkling jewels, and yet somehow, she seemed to outshine everything around her. It wasn't what she wore or how she looked, it was who she was. Her husband stood beside her, tall and composed, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The energy between them was palpable, an unspoken bond that told anyone paying attention that this was a partnership built on something far deeper than appearances or wealth. Together, they faced the room, the staff, the diners, the manager who still looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. And then, she spoke. "I came here today," she began softly, her voice steady but carrying an undeniable strength. "Not because I wanted to make a scene or prove a point. I came here because I was hungry and thought I'd find a warm meal and a welcoming place to sit." She paused for a moment, letting her words settle over the room like snow falling on a quiet street. "But instead," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the faces in front of her, "I was judged. Judged by how I looked. Judged by what I wore. judged by assumptions that had nothing to do with who I am. Her words weren't angry. They didn't need to be. There was something far more powerful in their simplicity, in the way they cut straight to the heart of the matter without pretense or theatrics. "I'm not here to hold grudges," she said after a moment, her tone softening just slightly. "I'm not here to demand apologies or make anyone feel small." She glanced at the hostess then, the young woman who had turned her away earlier, and offered a small smile that carried no malice, only understanding. "What I am here to do," she continued, her voice growing firmer now, "is remind all of us, myself included, that kindness doesn't cost anything. Respect doesn't cost anything. And yet, they're some of the most valuable things we can give to one another." The room remained silent as her words hung in the air like a melody that refused to fade. Even those who had initially dismissed her, those who had whispered and judged from their tables, now sat with their heads bowed slightly, as if ashamed of their own complicity in what had happened. Her husband stepped forward then, his presence adding another layer of gravity to the moment. "My wife has said everything that needs to be said," he began, his voice low but resonant enough to fill the room without effort. "But I want to add one thing." He turned his gaze toward the manager and then let it sweep across the rest of the staff before continuing. "This restaurant isn't just about food," he said firmly. "It's about hospitality. It's about creating a space where people feel welcome, where they feel valued, not because of what they wear or how much money they have, but because they're human beings." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before adding quietly but powerfully, "And if we can't do that, then what's the point?" The weight of his words was undeniable. The manager nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if trying to show he understood without fully knowing how to respond. "We'll do better," the manager said finally, his voice shaky but sincere. "I promise." The man nodded once before turning back toward his wife. She met his gaze with a small smile, a private exchange between two people who didn't need words to communicate. Together, they turned and began walking toward the door. The room seemed to exhale collectively as they moved through it, their departure leaving behind an atmosphere charged with reflection and quiet resolve. But just before they reached the exit, something unexpected happened. The hostess, the same young woman who had dismissed her earlier, stepped forward hesitantly. Her face was flushed with embarrassment, but there was determination in her eyes as she called out softly, "Wait." The couple stopped and turned back toward her. The hostess faltered for a moment before taking a deep breath and starting again. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, but she held her ground despite the tears welling up in her eyes. "I shouldn't have treated you like that," she continued after a moment, her voice steadier now. "It wasn't right." The woman studied her for a long moment before stepping closer. "Thank you," she said simply but sincerely. And then she added gently, "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." The hostess nodded quickly, blinking back tears as relief washed over her face. As the couple finally stepped outside into the cool evening air, there was a sense of closure, not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed what had unfolded inside. They walked hand in hand down the sidewalk, their pace unhurried, as if savoring this rare moment of clarity between them. "Do you think they'll really change?" she asked softly after a while. Her husband glanced at her and smiled faintly. "I think we gave them something to think about," he replied. "The rest is up to them." She nodded thoughtfully but didn't say anything else. Above them, the stars were beginning to peek through the night sky, tiny pinpricks of light against an endless expanse of darkness. And as they walked together beneath them, there was an unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't just about one restaurant or one experience or even one lesson learned. This was about something bigger, something deeper, a reminder that every interaction we have carries weight, and that sometimes, even small moments can spark profound change. Because at its core, this wasn't just a story about judgment or redemption or even kindness. It was a story about humanity and our ability to see beyond what's on the surface, if only we choose to look closely enough.